I was born in Christchurch in the suburb of Sydenham, and was a place called, the midwife's place called Nurse Greg's, which was next door to where a great aunt of mine lived, and my great uncle, he was a butcher by trade, and so that's where I was born. Today, of course, in Christchurch, I think it's the site of the Salvation Army barracks, and that was in 1929, what we call the last of the Roaring Twenties. Well, I didn't have any sisters, but my parents, my father, he was born in Littleton in 1896, and it'll be his birthday tomorrow actually. My mother, she was born in England, and in a little village called Ebley outside Stroud in Gloucestershire, England. They met up when my father, he went over in the First War. He got there towards the end of the war, and on his leave he went visiting the relations in England, and that's where he came across my mother, and so they corresponded for a number of years, and in 1923 he paid for her to come out on a ship, and they were married in 1924, and they were married in Littleton because my grandfather, he was quite an entrepreneur. He'd come out in the late 80s from England. He was in Littleton, he finished up, he was a baker by trade, and he had a baking business and tea rooms and grocer's shop and a number of other things in Littleton. He was a deputy mayor for a number of years and town councillor. So as I say, they got married, and my brother, he was born in 1925. Actually, he was born 1 year to the day that my parents got married. That was the 7th of April 1925 when he was born. And his name was Clive Allen Norton. The father, of course, was Alan James Norton. And my mother originally was Doris Gwendolyn Marchant. My mother, she always had great aspirations for her sons. I was called Royce. I think it was after Sir Henry Royce, who was the Rolls-Royce manufacturer man in England. And my brother, he was named Clive after Robert Clive of India. So, well, we didn't do a lot because, of course, it was Depression time, and of course, like a lot of those who were brought up in the Depression, you didn't have much, but you had enough. But of course, my parents, and they had known much better days than what we were brought up to, and I think when it wasn't until about 1939, the year the war started, they bought an old car. Prior to that, we didn't have any transport. We used to walk everywhere or ride the push bike. Well, yeah, I used to go out to my aunt and uncle's farm out at Downscaled. They had a mixed farm, cropping and a few house cows and sheep. That was the mixed farming, whereas today, of course, in Downscaled, it's all big time dairying. So I often got packed off to the farm for my holidays. And I think the year the war started, we went in this old car, we had an old Singer 9, and went down to Dunedin to visit a great aunt of mine, and that was quite something. But often the car, it used to break down. We'd come back from Christchurch and to go over the hill to Littleton, and it would conk out, and I can remember times when I sort of ran up the hill to Evans Pass and over the hill and got home before they did. They had to wait for somebody to give them a tow. The one we had in Littleton was it was a rented house, and it was only about 2 years old when we went into it. That was 1931. Of course, I was too young to remember initially going in, but we lived there till about 1946. And then we shifted. We had to get out of the property because the owner's nephew came back from the war, and she said he could have the house, and so we moved into the old Methodist parsonage for a couple of years before we shifted to Christchurch. I spent a lot of time making model things out of solid timber, such as toy warships and aeroplanes, that kind of thing. Of course, in those days, every child had a stamp collection, which of course, as I say, was, obviously before the days of all the electronics that they have today. Well, I wasn't really much of a reader. Didn't sort of read much in that way. Of course, we had comics in those days. They were always, sort of things you used to get. Oh yeah, we used to go to the films occasionally, or sometimes sixpence on a Saturday afternoon, and there was often the serial used to go on at the end of the film, and always remember there was one about Flash Gordon's trip to Mars, and of course at the end every time he was just about ready to be knocked off, but of course next week if you went it wasn't quite up to that, so he continued on his adventures. Of course I was small, and being small, in those days of course you got bullied. It was all part of the system. One was Gandhi, another one was Snotty. Of course, my brother, he used me as a punch bag because he was 4.5 years older than me. But, of course, as I grew older and grew up a bit taller, sort of, those things got left behind a bit. The older people, my grandfather, James Talbot Norton, as I say, he came from England on the 1800s, 1880s or something like that. And my grandmother, who's on the left there, she was born on the ship coming out from England, and she was named after the ship, which was called the Pleiades. The other people on the right-hand side is my Aunt Maud. She was the second child, and then on the left, the woman sitting down was my Aunt Gladys, and she was the eldest. Behind her was my Uncle Ray, who was the next in line, and then finally the one in the middle was my father, and below her was my Aunt Orpa, who She never married, but of course the others married and all had families. I only ever went to two schools. A primary school in Littleton was the West Littleton School. We had to climb up a big hill to get there every day. And of course, in those days, you used to come home for lunch, and we always used to run down the hill. And as I say, I went right through primary school there. And then I went to high school in Christchurch Boys High School. That was quite an arduous trip. We had to catch or get down to the railway station in Littleton and go by train through to Christchurch, and then walk up to Cathedral Square and catch a tram out to Riccarton and then walk from the Riccarton shops to the school, Boys High School, where I was there for 4 years at Christchurch Boys High. A friend of my brother's, he sort of got me a job in a builder's office. And of course in those days the building industry was all building lots of state houses, that type of thing, and I worked there and became a quantity surveyor. Of course in those days you used to get a big roll of plans of buildings and things, and you had to work out, take off all the quantities. And as I say, people used to say, what do you do as a quantity surveyor? And I used to say, well, you know, when they build a house they use a lot of nails. Well, my job was to count the nails. However, but I worked there for the one firm for 25 years. We sort of, as I say, started building, they were building state houses, and then we went on to, remember we built a kindergarten, and then we built lots of primary schools and secondary schools, and we built at the university at Canterbury, crowd I worked for, we built the first buildings on the site at Upper Riccarton, and we continued on there, and then the firm, they had a branch in Timaru, and then what was about 1967, the bloke I worked for, John Calder, he thought the streets of Auckland were paved with gold, and so we went up to Auckland via Hamilton. We worked there for about, well, the idea was to get work in Hamilton, but of course the building industry in those days was always up and down, and always remember trying to get work in Hamilton and subcontractors saying to me, oh well, I'm sorry, we can't give you the same price as we give the locals. So of course that didn't last too long, and then we finished up in Auckland. As far as World War II went, being in Littleton, of course, which was a seaport, the day or so after war was declared, soldiers came down, garrisoned the wharves and things, and then we, at school, they eventually built some air raid shelters, or prior to them building these shelters, we used to practice going up into the hills as as an air raid warning or something, or other practices. But of course that didn't last too long because most of the kids didn't come back to school that day. Oh yeah, well we had a lot of, my mother, she belonged to what they call the Seamen's Institute, and we had a always had a lot of chaps off the ships used to come, and she would bring them home for a meal. And sadly, I felt that a lot of those blokes that came back, they wouldn't have lasted the war out. The ships would have got sunk and they would have drowned. But I was, for kids growing up, it was exciting. And then, of course, I was too young to go to war. We had school cadets at school, but that wasn't very exciting. My father, of course, he'd been to the First War. Well, he was a driver in the artillery. Horses, of course, in those days used to tow the artillery guns and the limbers that carried all the ammunition and stuff. Actually, there's a certificate that he was presented with, a bit about his war service and stuff. During the war, we had all sorts of things like the emergency precaution scheme, which got into action actually one day. I think it was 1942 Christmas. There was a great fire in Littleton, and he was in the local St John's ambulance, and it was all rather spectacular as far as that went. My brother, he got into the Air Force during the war, but he didn't get away. The war had finished before he got away overseas. In those days, we had a big youth group at the church in Christchurch, the Linwood Methodist Church, which sadly fell down more or less during the earthquake. But we had this youth group, and of course in those days you had morning and evening church services, and it was an occasion every year. They had what they call Youth Sunday, and oddly enough I was preaching and I saw this young lady in the congregation, and of course after the service, the crowd, we all queued up to introduce ourselves to her. She'd been brought along by some people who she was boarding with, and we got together, but that was mid-year, I suppose, and by Christmas it was all off, and it wasn't until about May I was at a bit of a loose end, and so I gave her a ring on the phone just on the off chance she might come out with me, which she did, and it kind of all happened from there on. We got married in Hamilton, where wife Nairi, where her parents were at that particular time, and I had an old car, an old Ford 1938 bathback, two-door arrangement, and we travelled from Hamilton on up to Paihia, and parked the wagon on the foreshore and took the ferry across to Russell, where we had a week at the Duke of Marlborough Hotel. Of course, in those days, Paihia was next to nothing. That was in 1954, in November 1954. And then we travelled on up to Kaitaia and back down, stayed a night at Kaikoui, and then a night at Warkworth, and eventually back on down to the South Island. Of course, in those days, the you had to go across on the ferry from Littleton to Wellington, or vice versa, back from Wellington to Littleton. Yes, well, of course, our first child was Robin. She was supposed to arrive on the anniversary of our marriage, but she was 3 days late. She was quite small, and I think she had 3 months colic or something or other. That she didn't do too well for a start, but she continued, and then about, was it 17 months later, Philippa arrived. And then, of course, we had the 2 girls then. And then the next one was Andrew. He arrived, and then a couple of years later it was John. And then we had a 4-year gap before the twins arrived, Paul and Chris. Of course, as I say, I lived the first 2 years in Christchurch, 2 years in Christchurch, and then, as I said, I think we went back to Littleton. And in 1948, we moved to Opawa. And then when they got married, we built this house in Upper Riccarton, where we were for 12 years, and that's where all the family were born. From there we moved up to Hamilton for about 6 months in a rented place, 6 or 8 months or so. And then we moved on up to Auckland, and we bought this old, well, it was sort of a bungalow affair in Epsom, and we were there for about 20 years, I suppose. And in the meantime, we bought a batch at Wangaparaoa that we had for 10 years. And after we left Epsom, we had 2 years in a unit in Onehunga, Forbes Street, Onehunga, or as the land agent called it, Royal Oak. And then we bought the house in Swan Beach Road in Wangaparaoa. We had that for about a year before we finally retired. And I think we were there for about 18 years, and then subsequently sold that and moved on to where we are now, and that was in 2007 or 2008, well, round about then, and we've been there since. We always were involved in the Methodist Church. We always had great friends. Years ago, of course, when the twins were born, there was people from the church used to come around and help Nairi. Later on, of course, as I say, we moved to Hamilton. We were involved in the church there for a bit. We weren't there that long. And of course, we came to Epsom and Auckland, and again, we were involved in the church. And when we had any difficult times, there was always support in that direction. We sort of travelled around New Zealand. We had a caravan for 10 years that we towed from Cooper's Beach in the north was the furthest we went. That was one of our original trips, and then I think we went twice to the South Island with the caravan. Other than that, I think it was about 1970, was it? I took the 1971 or something or other. I took the girls to Australia and met up with my brother and his family, and we travelled from Brisbane down to Melbourne and back to Sydney. Other than that, later on in 1987, we did our first trip overseas. We flew to Perth and then on to Hong Kong and on to England, and we travelled around England, bed and breakfast places from Land's End to John O'Groats. I had cousins there that I caught up with, and then we did a trip to the continent, down as far as Rome and back up again. Following that, we did a lot of other trips as well over the years. Pacific Islands, we liked the Pacific Islands, Samoa, Fiji, Rarotonga, Norfolk Island, Tahiti. We do a lot of walking, and of course I'm interested in stamps. Actually, of course, when I was younger, I said we all had stamp collections, but of course by the time you got to be a teenager, you gave that away. Well, actually I gave most of the stamps away to a girlfriend's brothers. But when I was about 30, early 30s in Christchurch, I had to get my tonsils out, which was quite a bit of a job in those days, or at that age. And while I was convalescing, I sort of got interested in stamp collecting again. Generally, so far, the children are all married and have families, and our hope for them is we just hope and pray they just sort of, become reasonable, useful people. Oh no, as I say, we're still involved with our local church and the people there, and we're involved with Probus. We belong to a combined Probus group for the last 17 years at Red Beach, and I belong to a men's Probus here locally, just down the road. Belonged to that for the last 9 years, and we do quite a number of trips and things with them. Oh, well, going back years ago, I finished up in hospital when I was about the year the war started. A big girl hit me on the head with a tennis racket. And of course, in those days with concussion, you're in hospital for a week. Other than that, of course, I mentioned about getting tonsils out when I was 30 odd, but the last few years haven't been quite so good. I finished up getting a pacemaker nearly 2 years ago, and had a few ups and downs, but we've got the medication all seems to be right these days. Oh, go away.
Okay, so Mum, so okay, are we ready?